Hi, Neil Spears here from Best Photo Lessons. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about exposure. Now, I'll be real honest, if you have a point and shoot camera or a very basic camera that doesn't allow you to adjust exposure easily, this discussion isn't for you. This is for cameras that have either manual control or some way to control your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO independently. So let's get into it. Exposure on a camera can determine the look of the photo. There's two aspects. Broadly speaking, there's the intent of the photo, and then there's just the pure recording of light information, your exposure itself. Those are both aspects that you have to consider. For the latter, that's what most people think of when they talk about exposure. So let's talk about that. You have your aperture, which is on your lens. There's a way to control how much light comes through. So f16 is a very small hole, f2.8 is a very big hole. f2.8 lets a lot more light in, f16 lets a lot less light in. And those are both valid things to use depending on what you want. Then there's the shutter. Now typically it's actually two blades in the back of the camera. One pops up and then the other one follows it. That's how the shutter works in most cameras. There's some variations, but that's the basics of it. That determines how long the light is allowed through the camera. So that's your shutter. So that's, if you see a setting like 1/2 second or 1/60th of a second or 1/2000th of a second, that's your shutter. The last thing is ISO. That's how sensitive the recording medium, whether it's a digital sensor or film, that's how sensitive it is to light. ISO 100 is a lot less sensitive than ISO 1600. Now, ISO 100 gives you a cleaner image. ISO 1600 lets you shoot in darker places. Everything in photography is about compromise. What are you going to give up to get something else is really how it works. But for the most part, we've got these three things that make up the technical part of exposure: your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. So in a practical example, say you're photographing your kids playing football out in a field. You probably want to run a very fast shutter speed, somewhere around 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second, to freeze the action. When the child catches the ball, you want it really sharp. You don't want to see movement coming into the image. You don't want to see limbs blurring out. So you want a fast shutter speed. That means you're not going to get much depth of field because your aperture is going to be probably wide open, f2.8 or f4, somewhere in there, depending on your lens, of course. Now you can make up for that a little bit. You could get a more depth of field and a faster shutter speed by cranking your ISO to 800 to 1200, but that means that they're going to be a little bit grainy looking, and that's fine. You know, if you're only going to put it on Facebook, or if you're only going to make a 4:6 enlargement out of it. But if you want to make like a 12:18 enlargement, or something like I've got behind me, a 24:36 inch enlargement, that grain really starts to show up quickly. So you have to balance these three things. Most people like to keep their ISO as low as possible for the highest quality. However, they probably have to compromise a little bit on either the f-stop or the shutter speed. Okay. Now there's two two other aspects to this I find when I'm taking a picture. One is white balance. Are you using natural, neutral white balance? That can actually make a difference in the look of the photo and determine whether it looks like it's a good exposure or not. So if you're under incandescent lights, normal light bulbs, and you're set to daylight balance, everything goes very yellowy orangey. If you're under fluorescent lights, everything looks green if you've got daylight balance. If you've, there's so many variations on that, and that's a whole other description. But be aware of your white balance. Now, auto white balance tends to work pretty well, but it's not always 100% accurate. And so grab your manual, learn how to do a custom white balance or set the white balance appropriately for the scene. And it makes exposure a little easier to deal with because then you're seeing things accurately. That's the most important thing is where does it look to be. So keep that in mind. Grab your manual, read up on white balance. The last thing is intent. How do you want the photo to look? Do you want the shadows to have lots of detail? Well, in this case, shadows here. Do you want to have detail there in the shadows? Or do you want the shadows to fall away? Do you want the highlights to have lots of detail, or do you want them blown out? If you're shooting outside and the sun is behind the person, sometimes that's a really nice look. A high-key photo in studio where you have the background going to pure white. From a technical point of view, that may be wrong. We always say we want detail in the highlights, but in a high-key photo, a high-key portrait, sometimes you want those highlights to blow right out. It's a very soft, romantic look. So the intent of the photo can mean as much as anything else in determining your exposure. So when you're doing your exposure, all that aside, how do you use your camera meter? Well, we're going to show you a little clip here. I had to do it on my iPhone because it was the only thing that would focus through the viewfinder on my camera, and I'll also cut to a clip that I made of the back of my camera with a little bit more explanation on using your camera meter to look at exposure. Okay, so I'm going to bring up the exposure meter inside the camera. So it looks differently through the viewfinder with an iPhone than it does in real life. It's not actually overblown like that. That's just the video recording. Anyways, you can see at the bottom there, I can adjust the shutter speed. I can adjust the f-stop. So let's bring that down, and then we're going to increase the f-stop. To the right of the meter itself is the ISO, how sensitive it is. That last number is just how many shots I can take in a row before it runs out of temporary memory. Anyways, what you typically in a typical scene want to aim for is that middle position. If you go under exposure or over exposure, well, I'll show you that in a second, but that's what it looks like through the lens on a DSLR. Okay, so there it is through the live preview on the back of the camera, more like you'd see on typical point and shoots. Sorry, it's a little shaky. This is my iPhone as opposed to an actual camera. Anyways, you can see lowering the exposure makes it much darker, brightening it. Now you wouldn't see that through the lens because that's not a function of the lens. The other thing you should note is you should never trust a viewfinder on the back of a camera, a preview like this, because it's not entirely accurate. What I would suggest doing is bringing up the histogram, which is this guy right up there. Gives you a little bit better detail on what's happening. So in this case, we don't want to block up to the right too much, but we don't want to get too little to the left. So looks like by our histogram should be more like that. So for that middle point, we're talking about right there. Now Nikon, Sony's, other cameras will look a little differently, but that's your basic Canon look. It's very similar on others, just a little bit of changes as you go through the different cameras, but essentially the same tools. For more information on how to maybe adjust your exposure for specific situations such as high key photos or low key photos, we have lessons on those. Go check them out, learn how to use your exposure. It may not be centered in that -3 to +3 scale. You might want to bias it one way or the other to get the exposure that looks the best for your situation, because the camera meter is not always accurate. It may be trying to give you an exposure that's inappropriate for the photo you're creating. So please check out those lessons as well, because there are situations where you do need to adjust the exposure off of what the meter says. Thank you very much for watching this. Have a great day.